afternoon and Happy New Year. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. Thanks for joining me. 10 years ago, APTN launched an investigative news show with a small but mighty handful of reporters who knew APTN Investigates would consistently outperform and outclass much bigger media, covering stories that affect Indigenous people across Turtle Island. In those 10 years, winning 21 journalism honors for their work. Today, we are putting APTN Investigates in focus. Before I introduce you to our guests, let's take a look.
In its 10th season, APTN Investigates continues to tackle stories both compelling.
You're obstructing us now.
I'm walking down the street.
No.
And controversial.
And they know it's happening, they're just choosing to look the other way.
And we're reaching deep into the Investigates vault to revisit stories that made an impact.
I'm done.
Hey, but we have you.
It's fine. It's fine.
It is a hate crime.
Join us Sundays for APTN Investigate.
Joining me now in studio is APTN Investigates producer Holly Moore, and the man who built this investigative unit right from the ground up, from scratch, executive producer Paul Barnsley, and an unsung hero to many of you at home who don't know Josh necessarily. He's done a couple stories, but he's mainly behind the scenes, Josh Grummett, who does much of the magic to make these shows sing. Thank you guys all for joining me. Happy 10th birthday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, let's see, we start at the beginning here. So how did this come to be 10 years ago, Paul?
Oh, boy.
You were just minding your own business over at Wind Speaker.
Yeah. I guess what happened was the CEO, who's still our CEO, Jean LaRose, promised as a condition of license the CRTC that he would have an investigative news show. And they held him to it. They said, yep, you get another 5-6 years, whatever it was, and now you got to do that. And so Jean sort of started working on me.
Knock, knock, knock on your door.
And so I moved to Winnipeg.
Well, and this would be, it would be logical too, because you were the only person really across Canada who was doing full-time investigative news things, right? So for a newspaper, so Jean says, well, it's probably easier to train a newspaper person to do this than it is to take a TV person and teach them how to be an investigative journalist.
Yeah, well, he'd worked at the AFN, right, as a communications guy for a while. And I spent a lot of time haunting him. And we still managed to end up with a really good relationship.
Yeah.
There were some rough spots. And then, of course, I did a couple of stories about APTN itself while I was still at Wind Speaker. And a couple of Jean's predecessors suffered as a result, lost their jobs.
So this was smart of him, maybe. He's looking, going, before I'm taken out, let's give this guy a job. That's smart.
I sometimes
we see that happen
wonder.
in politics, right? So so he hires you. Did you have to come up with the whole concept of, like, was it known that it was going to be a half hour? Was it known, the structure of it? How did it? I
didn't even have a desk when I got here.
That's right. You were behind the door.
They stuck me in a corner somewhere, and I managed to build. I think you were one of the folks who used to make fun of me and putting the tape around my little corner of the newsroom, like Les Nessman and his walls. And yeah, it was basically come up with what you want. And I got a lot of help from Fran Compton.
Yeah.
Cheryl, TV veterans, you came on board, but you were like me, stained.
Well, my next question was going to be, let's talk about how we started. Like, how would you handpick this team to go? But you were lucky to have the Francine Compton and the Cheryl Mackenzie combo, so they at least knew the TV element.
Oh yeah.
So it helped. I guess you have the idea for what this Investigate show is going to look like, and they make it actually.
And what a lot of people forget, and it's easy because it's been a while now, is the first couple of years, one week it was Investigates, the next week it was InFocus. We went back and forth. We took turns.
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
That's right.
So at some point they took InFocus away from me, and I think when Cheryl took it over, and
it's my baby now.
Now it's yours, yeah.
Yeah. And we do it every week, and let me tell you, without Beverly Andrews, our producer here, it would not happen. Yep. So when you talk about the value of producers, it's like, I get that completely.
Oh yeah, and it goes on.
And it goes on and on.
Yes.
So how did you, once you guys had the idea for what the show was going to look like and what it was going to tackle, how did you go about handpicking who would be working on the show? Because it was a smaller staff back then.
Yeah.
What we started with.
Vera Hula was the news director at the time. She's still with the company, but doing a different role now.
Yeah, doing community relations.
And she insisted that I have Cheryl and Fran, which was incredibly smart.
Smart.
And then I'm trying to remember. It seems to me we advertise. We put out a job posting.
Yeah. Because I went,
Yeah.
a researcher, that would be really great. Because I'm super nosy. I should apply for that job. I'd be great at nosing around.
I believe it was Naomi Clark, who was with APTN for years, over at CTV now.
Yeah.
And Cheryl, myself, Martha Troyan, I believe, was one of the first.
Yeah.
And that was when we were still doing Contact. We did Contact for the first 2 years I was here, and every spare moment I had was making plans to get this thing going, right?
Yeah.
And then you came along, and then you went off on mat leave, and Kathleen Martins came along.
Yeah. And Josh.
And
right
Josh,
before
yes.
I went on mat leave, we stole Josh, who was doing casual. Were you casual down in the news department? You were doing
The Olympics.
Yes.
Yeah.
They had hired me because I was one of 2 freelancers in the city who knew how to work the program that brings name bars up at the bottom of the screen for the Vancouver 2010 Olympics coverage. And I got here and I was like, this place is amazing. I want to stay here. Worked my butt off to get to like Ken Welsh, our operation manager's attention, everyone else, and said, hey, I can edit for you. Hey, I can shoot for you. Hey, I can do graphics for you, etc., etc. That summer, Investigates does its first summer special, Ignored to Death, about the Brian Sinclair story.
Right.
And I happened to do some After Effects graphics for this guy to my right. And I don't know what he saw in me then. To some point, I'm still confused to this day. But that fall, I was hired full-time to Investigates.
And so
have
what
been there ever
is...
since.
Because I had said in the intro, I think a lot of people don't know necessarily what they've seen you do a couple stories, but they don't know like all that Josh is. So you tell me what your list of jobs is, and you guys can jump in and go, oh wait, but you forgot this one. Go.
How much time do you have?
Yeah, it's only an hour show, but
Primarily, I handle a lot of the editing. I do as much shooting as I can, so I like to be behind the cameras. My favorite place is in the edit suite, where I'm putting the show together and sort of shaping how it looks before handing it off to master control. I've also done researching, writing, shooting and editing, sound design, picking tracks, After Effects motion graphics.
picking tracks, hang on, that's first. So if you're watching an Investigates,
Yes.
you see, you're seeing stuff, but you're also hearing, oh, there's some
Yeah.
music over there. So Josh picks that up, makes sure that that sings with what you're seeing.
Exactly. And basically anything else I needed to do. The running joke for a number of years was that I was Paul's Swiss Army knife. I would just, he had a problem, he'd say, Josh, I have a problem. I'd be like, okay, let's take care of it. And then I did.
Yeah, he'd program my VCR for me.
Which is funny because I've had him come over and hook up a DVD or a Blu-ray player for me because I don't know how to do it. I think Josh at some point has been everybody's Swiss Army knife.
Yeah.
Pretty
Right?
much.
Yeah, he's definitely, I consider him the right hand, my right hand now.
Yeah, and you've been
Yeah.
for here how long? You're not new anymore.
No, I'm really not. It's
No.
been 2 years and 4 months. 2 years and 4 months, yeah.
And what made you want to come here? You just see, oh wow, what a kick-ass little team over there.
You
Gonna
know,
get in on the action.
I was working at CBC on the I team, and I was working on the Fifth Estate, and I was actually doing some investigative research for the Indigenous unit at CBC. And so I started to see that, you know, one of the biggest crimes in this country, crimes are perpetrated on Indigenous people, and that there's a really high level of accountability possible.
Right.
So I started to see that Indigenous investigative journalism was really, you guys were the only ones doing it.
It's
really
a gold mine for stories. Like a journalist looks and goes, how could you not want to be in that? There's no shortage. I mean,
there's just no shortage of stories.
And I think you guys would probably agree, if there was 4 investigative units, like shows, you would still have no trouble filling them.
Oh, you think about the content, and my theory was always, well, if you're going to be an investigative journalist in this country, this is where you should be looking for stories. Because if you're truly interested in holding powerful forces to account, and you're interested in giving voice to voiceless people, then everybody should be working. And I found sometimes at CBC, I'd be pitching Indigenous investigative stories, and I wouldn't be able to do them. I'd have to do a story about car loans, or I'd have to do a story about, you know, people getting ripped off. And I just thought, no, I need my work to have impact.
Meaning.
And so when I actually met Paul I invited him to an investigative conference that we started here with the CBC investigative unit, and they were doing a panel on Indigenous investigative journalism, and I thought, well, how come nobody's called Paul Bardsley?
Yeah.
And so I called Paul up, and we had a very brief chat, and I came here because I wanted to work with Paul. That's why I came here.
And then you got here, and we're like, because we had to lose Fran Compton. She went to Ottawa, so that was a big loss for Investigates. But then we very quickly found out, but this is such a gain as well, right? I remember going, because there was a lot of uncertainty when Fran was leaving, like, how is it going to be without Fran? Because she was such a staple of all that. And we got a Holly, and it's like, okay, thank God.
And let's not forget, Todd was in there for a little while.
That's right. Todd was hosting and producing and reporting. That's
right. And he went on to bigger things. He's doing a phenomenal job in Ottawa now with Nation to Nation.
He has his own very own show with Kenneth Jackson, who we'll see coming up after the break, which reminds me we should go to a break right now. But when we come back, we're going to see some of the most memorable moments from APTN Investigates' first 10 seasons, so stay with us. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Welcome back. So when you've won 21 awards over 10 years, it's tough to pick just a few highlights, but our show is only an hour long, so we actually had to pick just a few. So let's start with the story that put Investigates on the map right out of the gate, when a shoebox of documents was given to reporter Kenneth Jackson and led to this with a high-ranking political operative in the Stephen Harper government. Let's watch.
You're denying writing an email on August 6th at 7:01 saying you spoke to the PM last night about the cabinet shuffle involving Duncan?
That wasn't true. I spoke to somebody, but it wasn't the Prime Minister.
You're saying that you're lying then, that email?
Yes.
But you knew about the cabinet shuffle before it happened. You told that.
Like you did know about that, sir.
And you were...
You both agreed it was a good thing for the water.
Well, it's a good thing for a whole number of reasons.
Yeah.
And we also have an email from you to a INAC bureaucrat where you actually mentioned the company.
It started out as H2O Pros. That wasn't going to work because it was direct sales, correct?
That I don't know anything about.
So,
I don't know anything.
Global Group started about 4 months ago. It was changed because H2O Pros wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to fly with Mike Holmes. Is that?
I have no idea. These are things I don't know anything about.
Could we just sit down and just talk?
No, like this is just like my ripping it.
But the best thing is to get ahead of it, right? We're giving you a chance to get ahead of this. You know, we have a contract, you know.
You signed it. She gets 20% gross.
I witnessed it. I didn't sign it.
You were there.
So it's...
She gets 20% for being the face of the company. Yeah, we haven't been able to bring her in and see her. Is she doing any work for the company, or is she just sitting back and collecting?
No, she works there. She works there.
We haven't seen her. We haven't been able to get her in front of us. She's the agent of the company. She's the face. It says right here. But we haven't been able to get her to come on camera. We did find her online, though. We found her ads, her escort ads. She has 71,000 views on serve.ca. You may have met her on there. You know what we're talking about?
I think I have it here.
You don't want to get ahead of this? I mean, just sit down and
do you know a name? Do you know a guy named?
That remains every bit as awkward to watch, 10 years later, yet gratifying as well. So tell us a little bit about the Bruce Carson story.
Oh man, it was my chance to be Ben Bradley for a few weeks, and those guys were definitely Woodward Bernstein-like in the way they pursued this one.
Yeah.
I got a call from Jorge, and he says, I know this guy. He works at the Ottawa Sun, or he used to. He just quit. He's freelancing now. And he's got something you should have a look at. So I got in touch with Ken Jackson, that's the guy. And Jackson was so cagey. He was convinced we were going to steal his story and hip check him out of the equation, right? So he's sending me all these pictures of the documents, but he's got little pieces of paper covering really key moments. It's like, if you want to see the rest of it, let's talk.
That is so Ken Jackson. That's exactly how I would want Ken Jackson.
Yeah.
Ken Jackson's story to shake down.
And the thing is, he was a crime reporter, a good one.
Yeah.
But he didn't know anything about First Nation stuff. Didn't know a lot about political or government stuff. Jorge knew that, but Jorge said, all right, we need to put our heads together and figure out what the heck's going on here.
Because the story was,
yeah.
In a nutshell, it was Bruce Carson, who was a backroom guy for Stephen Harper, and he had a girlfriend?
Yeah.
It was a girlfriend who was a business partner, and they were trying to get government contracts.
Yeah, my understanding of it,
water
and even all these years later, I got to be careful what I say. But she definitely was in the sex trade, and it's my belief we stayed away from one other individual involved who was in a partnership with her. I won't use the word, but I believe they were playing Bruce. She said to him, you know, one big score, and then we'll run away together and live happily ever after. And that was never the intention, unfortunately, for Bruce.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a key guy. He was actually chief of staff in the PMO for a little while.
Yeah.
And one of Harper's best friends.
Yeah. And this was it. This took him down. And then, of course, all the other media was like, hey, APTN, what's this? APTN Investigates, right?
It was chaos. And
yeah,
there was obviously the PMO got involved, so now we're playing at a level I'm not quite used to.
Yeah.
And lawyers are. It was funny because a lawyer I already knew from a big conservative firm in Calgary called us the day after we did that interview with Mr. Carson and said, here are the 5 areas that we'll find contentious and we will take action if you go there. And so we got our legal wizard, Mr. Robert Sokolsky, involved, and I was involved. And we're going back and forth, getting ready to produce the story. And I wish I could remember the 5 areas, but for the most part, we had no trouble with any of them. You know, they were trying to mold the story, and between Bob and myself going back, with Clark Hunter was the name of the lawyer in Calgary. You know, we got sort of stick-handled through all the dangerous legal spots. It was a scary story. A man's reputation was at stake. We wanted to get it right. And when it ran, we got our hands forced by the PMO. They called in the cops and the ethics commissioner and one other federal agency, sent out a letter, public letter, a news release basically.
Yeah.
And we go, oh, we got to get it on the air tonight. We had planned on running it, you know, a couple of weeks later. That's
another thing that people don't know too is, right, just because you see it on the TV today doesn't mean it was planned on going to air that day. There's a lot of factors behind the scenes that force your hand to, sometimes before you have all your I's dotted and T's crossed, but you got to go, and it's it was terrifying but thrilling ride.
I think it was good for the whole network, I really do.
It was.
I mean, Globe and Mail did a profile on the whole APTN News division, the little network that could. Right. We got, I don't know, I'm trying to remember now, Maclean's, the Ryerson Review, you know, all over the place.
Yeah.
And apparently, if I'm remembering correctly, our servers crashed that night. We had so many hits on the website.
I do remember now that you mentioned that. Okay, so another big one too is the next clip that we're going to show is David Blott was revealed by APTN to have been preying on residential school survivors in helping them or charging them excess fees and interests of like 60% on loans to residential school survivors who needed help filing for their compensation. Let's take a look at a clip from that story.
Sadly, Annie was sick when she spoke to us and died that month before her story aired and cases were put under review. But it was complaints from blood survivors that convinced BC Supreme Court Justice Brenda Brown to order the probe of Blott & Company files and Honor Walk, the form-filling company that worked with the Calgary law firm.
story that put APTN Investigates on the map too, and had repercussions for the lawyer. I mean, it's not just that we show these stories. Oftentimes, we show these stories, and then there's the fallout that is.
We also, incidentally, had the only footage of Blot. So that was something that happened where we get requests because we're one of it was the only network that had some footage of Blot walking into the courthouse.
Did you shoot it?
That's a bit of a story. We had, on that court day, it was both Rob Smith, another Investigates reporter, and myself who were helping Kathleen with the story. We had Rob Smith at the main courthouse entrance, and then myself at sort of the rear entrance.
Yeah.
And Rob was able to get Blot walking in, and I was able to get footage of Blot inside the courthouse talking to someone on the steps, and then leaving as well. So
how do we know what he looked like?
Frankly, I didn't. I was just getting everybody who walked out, and then Kathleen comes up to me later and says, "You got Blot," and I'm like, "Okay, sure, that sounds great."
We had a photo from the school yearbook, University of Alberta Law School.
That was like 20 or 30 years old.
Yeah, it was.
Right, so you're trying to do the mental gymnastics of how he would have aged, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And Kathleen, who was in the courthouse, would have seen him, but you can't communicate.
Exactly.
With people outside, so you're just hoping somebody gets something as they roll through. Okay, we have another one. This is a story, I did this story, Hurting for Work. And it was a story that began with me noticing that all the garbage collectors in my back lane were young Indigenous guys. And I thought, oh, this might be a nice, warm, fuzzy story for the news department if this newly hired company that City of Winnipeg hired to do their garbage collection, if these guys are going and making an effort to hire young Indigenous men. It turns out that wasn't a warm, fuzzy story. There was something much darker. Take a look.
It's very physically demanding. It's a very hard job. You have to be very physically fit to do this job and have, mental toughness to do it.
There's times we've gone and grabbed garbage bins and there's like big pieces of brick and stuff in there, and that stuff's not supposed to go in a garbage bin. That's where some guys are getting like back injuries because it looks like it's not that heavy, but then you go to dump it and find bricks and stuff in it.
So a bunch of Freedom of Information requests that were submitted with the city and with the province showed that the guys you just saw, the swampers, huge amounts of injuries that they suffered. They were temporary day laborers, so they had low pay, they had no benefits, they were getting hurt on the job, and so it just goes to show you that, and I should say that the city no longer has that company as their garbage contractor. So the work does, oftentimes, as you guys have seen in Investigates, has some results, right?
Yeah.
And you won a CHA award for
that one was one. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. How do you even remember them all? There's 21 award winners. How do you remember? That was one of the award winners, though, for labor reporting. Okay, so let's go on to another one. This one's one of my favorites because I'm Métis, and so of course I would love it. There was a fight over the Bell of Batoche, the mystery of who has the Bell of Batoche, and it was APTN Investigates Todd Lamrand who went and found the Bell of Batoche. Let's take a look.
Trouble with his water line and wanted them to come down to the basement and take a look. That's when McKay alleges he said,
"Look, come here, I'll show you something," he said. "You won't believe it," he said.
And what happened
next? When he opened that little door, that door on the side of the stairway there's a door there, and he opened it, and that's where we seen the bell.
McKay's description of the bell with its wooden supports sounds very similar to this last known video taken in 1990.
That was another story that we had, and I believe CBC did a story on it too, right? There was
it had a lot of crossover.
Yeah.
So the other really great thing about APTN in general and APTN Investigates in particular is that it has this incredible crossover appeal to a mainstream audience. So often there's things that you guys are breaking and that we're breaking that other media pick up. And the Bell of Batoche is actually a 1-hour documentary. Yeah. Based on Todd's work, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
And now I'm trying to remember how that all ended, because now there's questions that wasn't actually the Bell of Batoche.
Yeah.
We don't have a final answer on that one yet. I know that I'm trying to remember who the producer for CBC was. A big hitter. Starwitz might have been.
Mark. Yeah, Mark Starwitz. Yeah.
I mean, he's as big as it gets in documentary film work. And he set out, I think, to disprove Todd's premise that, this is the Belle Batoche. And it was a fascinating sort of wander through the mists of time. And they'd come to the conclusion that this was a different bell, that the original Belle Batoche had been melted down, and who knows, it wasn't there to be found anymore. Eh?
The Holy Grail.
Yeah, but the central character in this, Billy Joe Delarond, is just a, what's the word?
A character.
A real
character. Yeah.
And I don't know if he even knows whether this is the right one. He insists it is. But the Métis folks, I think, have still got a mystery to solve.
Yeah, poor Métis. Okay, so let's go to another clip. Against Their Will. This was another big award winner. It's a story about the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. It was by Cullen Crozier. Let's take a look.
The paper that she was being pressured to sign was a consent form to undergo tubal ligation surgery, a virtually irreversible procedure that would prevent her from ever becoming pregnant again. According to Pelche, this all happened within a matter of hours after having given birth.
This is actually, I mean, that was a good story, won a big award, but it's also a good story about how small this little engine is that we have here at APTN. That was the doctor you saw in that is Holly, APTN Investigates producer, who sometimes doubles as actor. And I think about that too. Josh, you're kind of like the god of reenactments. If you have a story and you don't have the visuals to cover it, but it's a TV, so you need to have visuals. Oftentimes a reenactment of something would be what you would use as a journalist to tell the story. And for somebody like me, who came from a print background, I can't get my head around necessarily what we want reenacted or how it would look. And Josh, again, does that sort of thing. Tell us a little bit about the reenactments that, I mean, you've done, how many of them that you've written, scripted?
I have lost count. It's very often that we'll be doing a story about something that happened in the past, and simply like no one was there to record it, to get footage. We can't request security camera footage. So the most powerful way to tell the story is then to reenactment, and I've done several for you, several for Investigates. Against Their Will was a unique request because obviously we can't just walk into a hospital and say, hey, we're here to film, can we just turn the camera on?
Yeah.
But we were able to form a connection with a clinic here in Winnipeg that allowed us to shoot there after hours. And Cullen, who did the story Against Their Will, had this pitch about women who had been sterilized against their will. So we put it together. It was about 15 people in that clinic for about 4 hours. It was a whirlwind shoot. I'm still surprised we got it all done. Yeah. But it's just a perfect example of how reenactments can give emotional weight to something that you cannot do with simply documents, with simply giving people time to speak on camera. Sometimes you just have to illustrate it in that way, and I think it worked very well for that story. It
did, and I had a story, Rags and Riches.
Yes.
That was almost entirely a reenactment. That's right, because we had a couple interviews, but it was a story about a now defunct, basically, for all intents and purposes, organization, so you couldn't go and get the visuals of it, of stuff that had happened, and there was nothing really left of it, and it was just all reenactment.
2 major reenactments for that one. The first was a boardroom meeting that was, again, about 8 people, all from here in APTN, speaking of the small engine.
Everybody who works at APTN, they should know that when you start a job here, you're probably going to be picked to come and do an APTN Investigates reenactment at some point in your career.
I'm going to be like, hi, my name is Josh. But yeah, we did one in the boardroom with about 8 people just arguing about what was happening on the screen on the projector.
Yeah, fake arguing about nothing.
Yes.
Yeah.
With printed, booklets and everything. Another in a restaurant where some of the deals were reported to have occurred, etc.
Yeah.
And again, there are some questions about reenactments, but I strongly feel that they can add emotional weight. They are a great way to illustrate stories. It worked well for Rags and Riches as well.
Yeah. So Holly, I want to ask you and Paul, I think that people probably don't understand how much work goes into these stories. I don't just mean like the editing, the shooting of them, but how much of the digging happens beforehand. Can you guys give us some examples of what were the ones that kind of were the longest stories percolating before we saw them on air?
Whoa.
I'll let Paul answer. Yeah.
I'll start. I think of one Holly did last year about quote-unquote Indian hospitals. It was based on about a 300-page book that the author, Gary Geddes, basically emailed me and said, will you read this, please? I've read your work online, and you seem to know a little bit about this. Proof it for me. And I actually talked him out of one chapter. I won't say which one, but Gary knows. Hi, Gary. And then I lent it to Holly, and I said, we got to do something about this. And then Holly gets to work, and she gets on the phone, and she starts doing searches, and she can get an awful lot done. It's pretty scary, actually, sometimes. And before we knew it, we were running around the country interviewing people, and it was really strong and really important. And I guess there's another class action lawsuit bubbling up right now.
Yeah.
As a result of that story.
Yeah, well, I mean, the really cool thing about working here is that we can travel. So as part of every single place that I went, so I went from Edmonton to Hamilton and a bunch of places in between, I made an appointment with the archivist of that province to see what kind of holdings they had. So I went to the McMaster Health Library, I went to the Hamilton City Archives, I went to the Hamilton Spectator. I just hit an archive everywhere that I went, and I built in an extra day of shooting. So I would say we probably have one of the largest collections of photographs and documents, letters. You know, I have a pile this bigger of just about the Indian hospitals and tuberculosis sanatoriums.
Wow.
And I really think that one of the things that we can do as journalists is contribute to the public record of those things. So as part of my show, I tried to use as much archival material as I could. Of course, we realized pretty quickly that we don't have a budget for archives.
Yeah.
So Paul in his grace.
Like Josh could do.
Paul in his grace was, gave me some time and money to do that. So, yeah.
And that's for 1 out of 24 stories last year. So it just never ends.
Yeah.
We do, they do, talking about my team, and past, present, and probably future members of the team deliver more for the buck than anybody else. I mean, Fifth Estate, W5, those guys, they have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 times as many people.
Yeah.
And we're producing about the same number of minutes, and those minutes have been judged by various award judges as being pretty damn good.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and I know, I mean, it is just, how many, so we started out with how many staff in how many reporters in Investigates?
Oh, it started with 4 people.
And now we're up to
then
how
we
many
started adding, and we're at 9 now, I believe.
9 reporters.
Yeah.
I mean, that's still so incredibly small. I don't think that people who aren't in this business probably don't really grasp just how it's a fraction of what you see at W5 or Fifth Estate or any of the like 60 Minutes, any of the American ones.
It's an extraordinary amount of television.
Yeah.
So when I tell people that I produce with Paul and the team 23 to 26 half hours a year, it's like their jaw drops.
Yeah.
They're like, well, who's your shooting team? Who's your sound
team? Oh, the shooting team happens to be the editing team,
and I'm like, sometimes it's just one person. Yeah, or Josh, right?
Josh.
It's an extraordinary amount of television.
Yeah.
Like.
And I think too, speaking as somebody who, I mean, I was with Investigates for 9 seasons, and you are doing 4 about a year. But you've also got all these other stories that you're working on that might not come to air in this season, maybe next season or the season after. And then you're still getting, because as your stuff airs, people start to feel comfortable, and it's like, oh, that reporter, I should get in touch with them because I have a similar story or something. So then you're taking in all the new leads, or you're digging up some new leads. You're still trying to bring pots from the back burner to boil from years ago while meeting deadlines for... It is incredible.
This ties into sort of your question from before about how long it takes to work on a story.
Yeah.
It varies, because I know that we've had stories with leads in research that have been around for 2 years, 5 years, 8 years before they finally make it to air. And then sometimes it's something happens and we have to pivot quickly to designate a future episode. Okay, we're going to cover this there.
The Colton Bushey one that Rob Smith did, like on a dime.
3 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take another break here, and when we come back, we're going to have the two newest members of APTN Investigates team join us, so stay with us. Hello, welcome back. Thanks for joining me. And joining me in studio are the newest members of the APTN Investigates team, John Murray and Chris Reed.
Hi.
We could call you the newbies, I guess, right? The newest. We've just spent the past 40 minutes talking about like how there's been a lot crammed into 10 years of APTN Investigates history. You don't realize it until you start unpacking, and it's like, wow, there is a lot. But John, how long have you been here now? This is your
actually,
second
it's been almost. This is my second season. Yeah, it's been almost 2 years now.
And this is your first season, Chris?
Yes, I've been here since June.
Since June. Yeah. I want to know why you guys both. Well, I'll start with you, John. What was your journey to joining the Investigates team?
Well, I actually applied for the fellowship. I was the inaugural fellow, and
tell the fellowship through CAJ.
Yes, the CAJ,
Canadian
APTN.
Association of Journalists.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it was a partnership between CAJ and APTN, and it was actually the first year of the fellowship.
Yeah.
So I was the inaugural fellow.
And before that, you were doing radio.
That's right. Yep. I was on radio in Edmonton, community station.
And it was Indigenous news.
That's right. It was a completely Indigenous program.
Right.
Yeah.
So this was kind of because a lot of people would come from mainstream media to come here, right? You came from Indigenous news to Indigenous news, so that's.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But not a TV guy either.
No, not at all. No. I even kind of shied away from the camera at first. You know, it's like, I'll do lots of VOs, no problem. But yeah.
I know that feeling. I know that feeling. How did you end up here, Chris? You came from CBC in June, like you said?
Yes, CBC Radio, and I was interested in, departing from kind of the daily news world into, longer, deeper dives into topics, and so APTN Investigates appealed to me in that way.
How long were you doing daily news for in mainstream media?
Oh gosh, it's been an eternity. No, I think I've been working in, daily news since on and off since about 2002, 2003. Yeah.
So it's and that daily grind. I mean, there's a thrill associated with daily news, of course, to hit your deadlines and whatnot. But it wears on you after a while, and you kind of look and go. As a journalist, I want more. I want something meatier, deeper, something that you can flex different muscles with, right? And you were feeling that draw at that point.
Yeah, I almost feel like I've become an academic in some regards. There's a lot of research involved, a lot of trips to the library, which I enjoy a lot of archival stuff, and then, sometimes you get to meet the real people that you've been reading about in your research, and then it becomes really even more interesting. And,
What's the most challenging thing that you found when you made the jump over to Investigates? What was most challenging for you?
Aside from being on camera. A lot more research, just like Chris had said. It's incredible, how much you dive into things and really start digging, and you start looking, and sometimes it goes nowhere.
Well, we were talking about that during the break, too, how the frustrations with you have a file, and what you see that goes to air isn't necessarily the only work that's been done on that story, right? There's lots of going down rabbit holes, and this is a dead end. And sometimes it's a short trip down the rabbit hole to realize it's a dead end, and other times it's a much longer meandering trip down the rabbit holes to realize it's a dead end, and you got to pop back out and get back on track somehow. Yeah. And all while still under deadline. I mean, even though they're the longer form pieces and you don't have a daily deadline, you still have a slot that your story has to be ready to fill, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Had you done any TV before you came here, or was it exclusively radio and print?
Journalistically, it was almost all radio and online stuff. I mean, I've done some acting work in front of the TV camera, but
what's the? Did you find it hard to start constructing stories, these big, deeper stories, and construct them so they work for TV?
Well, we were talking about going down rabbit holes, and that for me was a bit of a challenge in terms of knowing how long to go down a certain rabbit hole before deciding it wasn't going to pay off. I mean, especially when you're looking into a story that happened 40 plus years ago, which was what I was doing. I mean, you can spend a lot of time just calling every person with a certain last name in a phone book in a certain area, that kind of thing, or trying to figure out if the person in this newspaper article is the same person over here that did this thing, and that sort of thing. So
that's such a good point to bring up too, is the knowing when to stop. Like there's a, when I'm digging, and you've got to know whether you keep digging or whether you look and go, I think this might be a dead end, and to back off, because again, you're under that deadline pressure.
Yeah. Indeed.
John, why don't you tell us about, you've got a little clip from one of your shows. Tell us what that story was about.
That was Cowboys and Pretendians is where the clip is from. And that looked at stereotyping and pretendians, people playing Indian in Hollywood. And I actually got a musician named Frank Wallin to give me permission to use his music for my opening sequence. And I think, I'm not sure, Josh can confirm this, but I think it was the first time lyrics were used in the music and Investigates as well, or lyrics, yeah.
I want to see this. Let's go to that clip.
Personally, I should prefer to see the Aborigines. And the Indians, too. And the Indians, too. This should be most enlightening.
What makes the red man red? Teach them all about Red Man. What made the red man red?
Film and television is hard work. On either side of the camera. Actors can wait years for a dream role. And some writers never get to tell their stories. But what happens on screen reflects and shapes culture. And for Indigenous people in the industry, they see stereotypes or typecasting.
And the director took mud from underneath a car and put it on her face and said, "You're supposed to be a dirty Indian."
He's afraid to be Comanche. And red face. Are the solutions coming through Hollywood?
And it's one thing for like the big Hollywood productions not to care. You kind of expect them not to care. It's been 100 years of them not caring.
Teach them all about Red Man. Red Man.
History books, your holidays, Thanksgiving lies and Columbus Day. Tell me what I know more than the teacher. Tell me what I know more than the preacher. Tell me why you think the red man is red, stained with the blood from the land he bled. Tell me why you think the red man is dead, with the fake headdress on your head. Tell me what you know about thousands of nations, displaced and confined to concentration camps called reservations. We died for the birth of your nation.
You got to have a lot of fun putting that together, hey?
That was a lot of fun to put together, absolutely. And Frank was a great guy to talk with about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you prefer? Would you prefer, because I mean that was kind of a big broad stroke topic of Hollywood's portrayal of Indigenous people, right? And then you get to pick who you want to talk to and the angle, and you get all that creativity with picking clips to use and the music and stuff. Do you prefer that, or do you like the stone cold, hard news, facty stories?
Oh, that's a tough call. That really is, because, that was so much fun to do. Talking to everybody in the industry was incredible. Like, giving me insight into this industry I knew nothing about.
Such insight, too. You picked really great people to interview for that.
But at the same time, digging deep and finding something that is going to,
the dog with
rattle
the bone.
some. Yeah, exactly. So.
Yeah, dog with the bone. Okay, Chris, let's take a look at, you picked a clip for us to watch. This is from your first show with APTN Investigates. Tell us a little bit about it.
Indeed. So our show was about an experimental behavior modification camp, which was run in the 1970s. It was funded.
That doesn't sound real.
No, yeah.
It does not sound real.
It was real, unfortunately. And so a group called the Ranch Airlo Society, which is an organization that is very respected in Saskatchewan. They do a lot of social services work on contract for the government. They had an idea for a kind of camp where they would send young offenders, and of course, as it turned out, they were mostly Indigenous young offenders.
And this was in what province?
In Saskatchewan, yeah. So they would send these boys up to this camp, and the idea was you put them in this wilderness setting for a year, 2 years, or longer, however long it took to modify the behavior of the boy and change him from a kid who was into stealing cars and that sort of thing into a kid who was more into paddling a canoe 50 miles across a lake or something like that.
Yeah.
But
it sounds like it could be nice, except for when you talk about the behavior modification, and then it sounds a little bit.
Yeah, it was a very brutal experience, especially for this guy Richard Yarema that we spoke with. And so we took Richard Yarema and another guy named Guy Dumas back to this remote camp in northern Saskatchewan on Norbert Lake in Saskatchewan. And
this is the clip?
They're going to see what happened there. Guy Dumas performs a ceremony, and we're going to see that right now.
Awesome. Let's take a look.
Rancherlo may not condone those methods today, but Richard Yarema and Guy Dumas say that's the way it was in Wilderness Challenge. And so Yarema and Dumas traveled with us from Dauphin, Manitoba to the former Rancherlo campsite on Norbert Lake in northern Saskatchewan. It is here that they hope to begin healing.
I don't know if I can do this. Take your time. There's a lot of pain in this camp. There's a lot of hurt, a lot of loneliness from family, and you know, this way of life has taught us to forgive. I can only speak for myself. I let it go. I have to let it go. I'm almost 60 years old. I've carried this for over 45 years. And today I want to reconcile. I want to let go. And let this place be part of our history. And to all of you that are out there, if you ever see this documentary, that we've blessed the place, we've said prayers in the Indigenous way, and carry on with having a good life.
That's hard to watch.
Yeah.
How was it to be there at that time?
Well, you know, I will say that I still get emotional watching that and thinking about it. And Richard Yarema and Guy Dumas are just incredible men, and I feel I feel honored to have know them and to have gone there with them and to be part of that. It was a really special and important event for me and for them. You know,
that's something that we. I think that makes journalists really love what we do. Is we do get to have so many of those. They're powerful moments. They're important moments. We get to tell people stories. That's an important story to tell. What do you guys want to do next? What's the next? You know, you're looking ahead. You're the future of APTN Investigates is ahead. We've got hopefully another 10, 20, 30 years of Investigates. What's next for you guys individually? Pick who wants to go first. We've got just a couple minutes left.
I'm looking at a kind of an unusual story in Indigenous history in Canada. This thing happened where some Dakota people, a group of Dakota people, came across the 49th parallel in the 1860s. And when they came into Canada, they were considered by the Canadian government, well, the Canadian government at this point didn't exist, it would have been the British Crown. They were considered to be American Indians that the Canadian or the British Crown didn't have responsibility for. So they got into this sort of unusual situation where the powers that be didn't know how to deal with them exactly. Long story short, they bought their own land, had it taken away by the government. It's a sad story, and we're looking into it.
I can't wait to see that too. John, we've got about 1 minute left.
Oh, all right.
What do you want to deep dive into?
Well, you know what?
Next?
I don't really want to talk about the next one, but I just wrapped up one that was in Alberta on the Orphan Wells situation, which is in the oil patch.
Right.
And that was really interesting, and spoke to some people that, you know, really are participant in the oil patch, and they want to have involvement in how to change things that go on, such as the Orphan Wells.
That's coming up.
And that's what's coming up next week, yes.
What, January what?
11th.
January 11th. Okay, we are out of time. I thank all of my guests for joining me, my former team, APTN Investigates. And thank you for joining us. This is the first In Focus of 2019. I'm so glad you could be with us as we talked about the 10 glorious years of APTN's award-winning investigative news program. This episode of APTN InFocus will be available for download as a podcast on our website, aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Melissa Ridgen. See you back here for APTN National News Tonight. Have a great afternoon.